The number on the screen was 0. Not low. Not concerning. Not the kind of number that makes you think there has been a banking error you can resolve with a phone call before your morning coffee gets cold. 0. With a single transaction listed below it. Wire transfer outgoing. Processed at 11:47 the previous night. $800,000. Recipient account ending in 4 digits I had never seen before. Authorization code, his. I sat at my kitchen table in the gray early light of a Tuesday morning and looked at that number for a very long time without moving. Welcome to Quiet Karma Stories. My name is Diana Reeves. I am 43 years old, and I am the founder of a financial consulting firm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. I built it over 9 years from a single retainer client in a shared office space I could barely afford, through a period of growth I can only describe as the product of relentless, unglamorous work, into a company that employed 6 people and managed relationships with 22 active corporate clients. The morning I am describing to you was supposed to be the most important day in the firm's history. We were scheduled to present the results of a 14-month strategic restructuring engagement to our largest client at 9 o'clock. The presentation had taken 6 weeks to prepare. The conference room was booked. The materials were printed. I had set my alarm for 5:30 specifically to review the executive summary one final time before driving to the office. Instead, I was sitting at my kitchen table at 6:15 in the morning, looking at a bank balance of $0 and a wire transfer authorization bearing the name of the man I had trusted with half of everything I had built. His name was Marcus Webb. I had known him for 11 years. We had met as junior analysts at the same firm, survived the same brutal first years in the industry together, and maintained a professional friendship across 2 job changes and 1 cross-country move before he had approached me 3 years ago about a partnership. I had thought about it for 4 months before saying yes. I had consulted 2 attorneys. I had run the financial projections 17 different ways. I had done everything a careful, methodical person does before making a significant decision. What I had not done, and what I will spend the rest of my professional life ensuring every person I advise never fails to do, was install the financial controls that would have made what he did that Monday night structurally impossible regardless of who he turned out to be. I picked up my phone. I did not call Marcus. His number was already going to voicemail, which told me everything I needed to know about the next phase of this situation. I called the bank's fraud department instead. The representative who answered at 6:19 in the morning was named Sandra, and Sandra had the particular quality of focused, unflappable attention that people develop when they spend their professional lives receiving calls from people in exactly the situation I was in. I gave her the account number, the transaction reference, and the authorization code. She asked me to hold. She was back in 4 minutes. "Ms. Reeves," she said carefully, "I need to ask you to confirm that you did not authorize or have prior knowledge of this transfer." I told her I had not. There was a brief pause. Then she said, "I am escalating this to our wire fraud investigation team immediately. I need you to not contact the receiving institution directly and to preserve all digital communications related to this account and your business partnership. A senior investigator will call you within the hour." I thanked her. I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. Outside the window, Charlotte was beginning its ordinary Tuesday morning. Cars moved on the street below. A neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. The early light was flat and gray and completely indifferent to the fact that 11 hours earlier, while I had been sleeping, the person I had trusted most in my professional life had wired $800,000 out of our joint business account and boarded a flight I would not learn about until the FBI told me 4 days later. I sat very still for exactly 3 minutes. I allowed myself that 3 minutes to feel the full weight of what had happened. Then I picked up my phone, opened my contacts, and called my attorney. There was a great deal of work to do. And unlike Marcus Webb, I was not going anywhere. The 9 o'clock presentation did not happen. I made that decision at 6:47 in the morning, 13 minutes after ending the call with my attorney, and I made it with the same precise, unsentimental efficiency I applied to every difficult operational decision I had made in 9 years of running a business. The client deserved an explanation. The team deserved an explanation. The conference room that had been booked for 3 hours and the printed materials stacked in their folders on the credenza in my office deserved nothing, because they were objects, and objects do not require consideration. I called my office manager first. I told her there was a financial emergency requiring my immediate attention, that the 9 o'clock was postponed, and that she should contact the client's executive assistant and reschedule for the following week without providing additional detail. She asked if everything was all right. I told her it would be. Then I called each of my 5 employees individually, in order of seniority, and told them the same thing in slightly different words. None of them asked follow-up questions, which told me that my voice, despite my best efforts at the controlled neutrality I had been practicing for 9 years, was communicating something that made follow-up questions feel inappropriate. The last call I made before leaving my apartment was to Marcus. I did not expect him to answer. He did not answer. His voicemail greeting played in the familiar unhurried cadence I had heard hundreds of times over 11 years of professional proximity, and I listened to the whole thing without leaving a message. I was not calling because I thought he would pick up. I was calling because I needed to hear, one final time, the voice of the person I had trusted, so that I could complete the internal process of separating who I had believed him to be from who he had demonstrated himself to be. It is a necessary cognitive step that grief researchers call disillusionment, and it is not pleasant, but it is considerably more efficient to do it deliberately than to let it ambush you at unexpected moments for the following 18 months. I ended the call without leaving a message. I put on my coat. I left. I did not go to the office. There is a particular cruelty in the way that betrayal colonizes the spaces that were previously associated with trust. My office, which I had built and furnished and staffed over 9 years, which contained the physical evidence of everything I had worked for, had become, in the space of a single bank notification, a location that belonged to a version of my life that no longer existed. I was not ready to walk through those doors and sit at my desk and look at the chair across from mine where Marcus had sat for 3 years while I had believed we were building something together. That would come later, when I had the internal architecture to handle it. It was not yet 6:50 in the morning. I did not yet have that architecture. I drove instead to a park on the eastern edge of the city where I had gone running 3 mornings a week for the past 4 years. It was a large park with a lake at its center and a paved path that circled the water for exactly 2.3 miles, which I knew because I had measured it the first time I ran it and had never needed to measure it again. At that hour on a Tuesday morning it was nearly empty. A man walking a large gray dog. 2 women moving at the brisk, purposeful pace of people who treat exercise as a logistical problem to be solved efficiently. A teenager sitting on a bench near the water's edge, headphones on, entirely absorbed in whatever was on his phone. I walked. Not ran. Walked, slowly and without destination, along the path that circled the lake. The water was flat and dark in the early morning light. The trees along the bank were fully leafed out, the particular dense green of early summer, and the air smelled of cut grass and lake water and the faint diesel undertone of the city waking up beyond the park's boundaries. A pair of geese moved across the surface of the lake with the unhurried authority of creatures that have determined their environment presents no meaningful threats. I walked and I thought, in the specific way I think when I am processing something significant, not in a linear narrative but in a systems architecture. I mapped the problem the way I would map a client's organizational crisis. Input. Variables. Constraints. Available resources. Probable outcomes across multiple response scenarios. The input was clear. $800,000 gone via a single wire transfer bearing Marcus Webb's authorization. 11 years of professional relationship terminated unilaterally and without notice. Business partnership dissolved in the most aggressive manner available to one party of a 2-party agreement. The presentation materials for our largest client sitting in their folders on a credenza in an office I had not yet entered this morning. The variables were also reasonably clear. The bank's fraud team was already moving. My attorney, a precise and experienced woman named Patricia Okafor who had handled the firm's legal work since year 3, was already reviewing the partnership agreement and the account authorization documents I had forwarded to her at 6:30. The wire transfer was a federal financial instrument, which meant its trail was permanent and legally accessible to the appropriate authorities regardless of where the recipient account was domiciled. The constraints were the variables I could not control. I did not know where Marcus was. I did not know which institution held the receiving account or in which country it was registered. I did not know how much of the $800,000 had already been moved onward or converted. I did not know whether he had anticipated the speed of the bank's fraud response or had assumed he had more time before the transfer was flagged. What I knew was this: wire transfer fraud leaves a federal paper trail that does not disappear. Every transaction in the international banking system is logged, timestamped, and traceable by the institutions and law enforcement agencies with the appropriate access. The money could move, but the record of where it moved could not be erased. Marcus had taken something that could be tracked. That was not a small thing. I completed 2 full circuits of the lake before I stopped at a bench near the water's edge and sat down. The man with the gray dog had gone. The 2 women had gone. The teenager was still on his bench, still absorbed in his phone, still entirely unaware that the woman sitting 40 feet away from him was quietly and methodically constructing the framework of a response to one of the largest professional betrayals she would likely experience in her lifetime. I sat for 20 minutes. I watched the geese. I let the specific quality of grief that comes from the collapse of long-held trust move through me at its own pace, which is the only pace it will agree to move at regardless of how efficient you are as a person. Then I took out my phone and sent Patricia a single message: ready to talk through next steps when you are. I have 2 hours before I need to be at the office. Her response came in 4 minutes: call me now. The partnership agreement has a clause you need to know about immediately. I stood up from the bench, walked to a quieter section of the path away from the few other people now entering the park, and called her. What she told me in the next 8 minutes changed the operational landscape of everything I had been calculating on my walk around the lake. Marcus had made a mistake. A significant one. And he had made it 3 years ago, at the moment of signing, in a document that Patricia had drafted and that he had signed in front of a notary without, apparently, reading the section on financial liability and restitution with sufficient attention. I listened to her explain it, leaning against the park's perimeter fence with the city noise rising steadily on the other side. When she finished, I said, so the personal liability clause covers the full amount. Yes, she said. And it is personally guaranteed. Not the business entity. Him. Personally. I looked at the lake for a moment. The geese had reached the far bank and were climbing out of the water with the unhurried dignity of creatures that have never once reconsidered a decision. Good, I said. Let's talk about the federal referral. Chapter 3, The Secret Revealed. Patricia Okafor had been practicing business and commercial litigation law in Charlotte for 21 years. She had the specific quality of stillness that very experienced attorneys develop, the ability to deliver devastating information in the same measured tone they use to discuss lunch, because they have learned that the information itself carries sufficient weight without requiring additional theatrical support. She delivered the next piece of information to me in exactly that tone. The wire transfer was not the beginning of this, she said. Based on what I am seeing in the account records you forwarded, I believe it was the conclusion. I stood straighter against the park fence. Tell me what you mean, I said. She told me. Over the following 12 minutes, Patricia walked me through a pattern in our business account records that I had not seen because I had not known to look for it, and that Marcus had apparently relied on me not looking for it, and that explained, with a precision that was almost architectural in its clarity, exactly how a person who understood financial systems well enough to exploit them had spent the preceding 14 months methodically preparing the conditions for what he had done the previous night. It had not started with the $800,000. It had started, Patricia believed, approximately 14 months earlier, with a series of expense account adjustments that were individually within the range of normal operational variation and that had been approved through the standard authorization process that Marcus and I had established when we formed the partnership. Small adjustments. The kind that a busy founder reviews in aggregate on a quarterly basis rather than examining line by line each month. The kind that, if you were looking at any single one of them, you would categorize as routine and move on. Except that they were not routine. When you assembled all of them in sequence, when you looked at the complete 14-month pattern rather than any individual transaction, a different picture emerged. One that required deliberate planning to construct. Over 14 months, Marcus had systematically rerouted a total of approximately $240,000 from our operational accounts through a series of vendor payment adjustments, expense reimbursements, and petty cash authorizations, each one small enough to avoid triggering the automatic review threshold we had set in our accounting software, each one plausible enough in isolation to look like ordinary business expense activity. $240,000. Before the $800,000. Before last night. The total was over $1 million. I absorbed this information standing in the park with the morning sun now fully up and the city noise building steadily on the other side of the perimeter fence. I did not say anything for a moment. Patricia, I said finally, how long did this take him to build? The systematic phase began 14 months ago, she said. But the infrastructure, the vendor accounts he used to route the smaller amounts, those were established earlier. I am seeing registration dates on 2 of the payee accounts that go back 22 months. 22 months. Marcus had joined the partnership 36 months ago. Which meant that 14 months into our partnership, when I had been entirely focused on the work we were building together and had trusted him completely with equal access to the firm's financial systems, he had begun constructing the architecture of his exit. And 22 months in, he had already built the routing infrastructure that would allow him to move smaller amounts invisibly while he waited for the right moment to take everything that was left. He had not betrayed me on Monday night. He had been betraying me for nearly 2 years. I walked back to my bench by the lake and sat down because my legs had developed the particular quality of unreliability that arrives when your body processes information that your mind is still catching up to. The geese had returned to the water. They moved across the surface in their unhurried way, entirely unconcerned with the recalibration happening on the bench 30 feet from their current position. I thought about the 22 months. I thought about every meeting we had sat through together during that period, every client presentation, every strategic planning session, every early morning when we had both been in the office before the staff arrived, drinking bad coffee and talking about where the firm was going. I thought about the performance review I had given him 8 months ago, in which I had formally noted his exceptional financial management instincts and his meticulous attention to operational detail. I had written those words. I had meant them. And at the time I was writing them, he had already been routing money out of our accounts for 6 months. The exceptional financial management instincts had not been a professional strength. They had been a methodology. I called Patricia back. The $240,000, I said. Is it traceable to specific accounts? All of it, she said. The routing is actually quite clean because he used a consistent pattern. That consistency, which I think he used because it was easier to manage, is now the evidentiary thread that ties everything together. So the federal case covers both the wire transfer and the systematic smaller amounts. Yes, she said. And the premeditation evidence, the registration dates on those vendor accounts, makes this considerably more serious than a single impulsive theft. This is organized financial fraud with a documented 22-month planning timeline. I was quiet for a moment. Patricia, I said, does he know that we have the account registration dates? She paused. If he did not expect you to look past the wire transfer, then no. He likely believes the visible trail starts with last night's transaction. I thought about that. I thought about a man who had spent 22 months building what he believed was a clean exit, who had taken what he believed was everything, and who was currently wherever he was believing that the worst thing I knew about was a single wire transfer from the previous night. He did not know about the 14 months of smaller transactions. He did not know about the vendor account registration dates. He did not know that Patricia had already assembled a complete 22-month timeline before 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. He thought he was 11 hours ahead of me. He was 22 months behind. I stood up from the bench. I need to be at the office in 40 minutes, I told Patricia. I want to schedule a call with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for this afternoon. And I need the full transaction timeline compiled into a single document before then. She said it would be ready by noon. I walked back to my car through the park, past the geese and the now busy path and the flat dark water of the lake. The morning had fully arrived. The city was running at its ordinary Tuesday pace, entirely indifferent to the specific recalibration that had occurred in a woman's understanding of the previous 22 months of her professional life. I drove to the office. I parked in my usual spot. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and unlocked the door and walked in and turned on the lights and made coffee. The chair across from my desk was empty. It would remain empty. That was not a loss anymore. It was a vacancy I was about to fill with something considerably more useful than the person who had previously occupied it. I sat down, opened my laptop, and began working. There was a great deal to reconstruct. And I had always been better at building than Marcus Webb had ever understood. The first person to arrive at the office that morning was my office manager, Renee, at 8:15. Renee had worked with me for 6 years. She had been my third hire, brought on at a point when the firm was growing faster than I could manage alone, and I needed someone who could function as the organizational center of gravity that kept everything else from flying apart. She was 51, precise, and possessed of the particular quality of professional loyalty that does not require constant acknowledgement because it has never been contingent on it. She came into my office without knocking, which she only did when she had already assessed that knocking would be an inefficiency, set a cup of coffee on my desk, and looked at me with the direct, evaluating attention of someone who has spent 6 years learning to read the difference between ordinary stress and something that requires a different category of response. She said, "How bad is it?" Not a question. A calibration request. I told her. Not everything. Enough. The account. The amount. Marcus. The fraud investigation that was already open. I watched her face move through 3 distinct expressions in approximately 4 seconds and then settle into the particular stillness of someone who has chosen function over feeling because the situation requires it. She said, "What do you need from me today?" That, I thought, is why she has worked here for 6 years. I gave her 3 specific tasks. The first was to contact all active clients with a brief communication noting that the firm was undergoing a routine internal restructuring and that all existing engagements would continue without interruption under my direct management. The second was to compile every contract, vendor agreement, and client retainer document that bore Marcus Webb's signature and send the complete set to Patricia's office by noon. The third was to remove his personal access credentials from every firm system, account, and platform before 10 o'clock, which was when the IT consultant I had called from the park would arrive to conduct a full digital security audit. Renee wrote all 3 tasks in her notebook without comment, looked up, and said, "Done." Then she picked up her coffee and walked back to her desk. I watched her go and felt something that I will describe as gratitude, because the English language does not have a more precise word for the specific relief of discovering, in the middle of a significant crisis, that the people you have built around you are exactly who you believe them to be. The morning passed in the specific way that crisis mornings pass, at once very slowly and very quickly, with the granular texture of 100 small decisions compressed into a space where there is no room for the kind of reflection that ordinary mornings allow. The IT consultant arrived and spent 2 hours systematically auditing and revoking Marcus's digital access. Patricia's office called at 11:40 with a question about the account authorization structure that required 40 minutes to resolve. The bank's senior fraud investigator, a methodical man named Robert Chen, called at 12:30 and spent an hour walking me through the investigation timeline and the documentation he needed from my end. Through all of it I was functional, precise, and entirely composed. The grief arrived at 2:17 in the afternoon. I know the exact time because I was alone in my office reviewing a client contract when it arrived, and I looked at the clock on my computer screen at the precise moment I understood that I was not going to be able to continue reviewing the contract for the next several minutes. Grief, in my experience, does not announce itself. It does not wait for an appropriate moment. It arrives when the adrenaline that has been running your system finally drops below the threshold required to keep everything else at bay, and it arrives with the specific weight of everything you have been managing without fully feeling since 6:15 that morning. I set the contract down. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the empty chair across my desk. 11 years. I had known Marcus Webb for 11 years. I had seen him navigate a brutal industry during the years when the industry was most hostile to people who had not yet established themselves. I had watched him work, had trusted his judgment, had made him a partner in something I had built with the specific unglamorous effort of 9 consecutive years of refusing to stop. And for 22 of the 36 months we had worked together, he had been systematically stealing from me. The grief was real. I am not interested in minimizing it or reframing it into something more acceptable. It was the grief of genuine betrayal, of discovering that a relationship you had believed was one thing had been something entirely different for longer than you had understood, and that the version of the past you had been carrying was not the version that had actually occurred. I sat with it for 11 minutes. I did not fight it or redirect it or apply any of the cognitive reframing techniques that self-improvement literature recommends for processing difficult emotions efficiently. I let it be exactly what it was, because it was proportionate, and because proportionate responses to genuine losses are not weaknesses to be managed. They are information about what mattered. At 2:28 I picked up the contract and resumed reading. But something had shifted during those 11 minutes. Something important and clarifying. When the grief moved through and the clarity came back, what remained was not anger, though the anger was also present and also proportionate. What remained was a decision. Precise, cold, and irrevocable. I was not going to call Marcus Webb and tell him what I knew. I was not going to post anything on any professional platform. I was not going to tell any mutual colleague what had happened, not yet, not until the legal process made it unnecessary to tell anyone because the public record would speak for itself. I was not going to do anything that would signal to him the state of the investigation, the depth of the evidence, or the involvement of federal authorities. I was going to do exactly what I had done for 9 years when the situation required it. I was going to work quietly, methodically, and without announcement, toward a specific outcome. And the outcome I was working toward was the complete legal, financial, and professional accountability of Marcus Webb for everything he had done. Not because I was angry, though I was. Because accountability, properly executed, is not emotional. It is structural. It changes the conditions under which the person who caused the harm is required to operate for the foreseeable future. I thought about what Robert Chen had told me on the phone that morning. He had said, in the careful language of a federal investigator speaking to a victim who was also a key witness, "Ms. Reeves, I want you to understand that wire fraud investigations involving this level of premeditation move faster than most people expect. The digital trail is complete and the authorization records are federal documents. What typically determines the outcome at this stage is the quality and organization of the supporting documentation provided by the complainant." I had thanked him and ended the call and immediately opened a new folder on my encrypted personal drive. Now, at 2:29 on a Tuesday afternoon, I began filling it. I was going to give Robert Chen the most organized, comprehensive, and legally precise supporting documentation he had ever received from a fraud victim in his professional career. I was going to do it because it was the right thing to do, and because it was the most effective thing I could do, and because Marcus Webb had spent 22 months believing that I was too focused on building something to notice what he was doing behind my back. He had been correct about that for 22 months. He would not be correct about it for a single day more. There is a specific productivity that belongs exclusively to the period immediately following a significant loss. I do not mean the frantic, unfocused energy of someone trying to outrun grief through motion. I mean the particular clarity that arrives when everything unnecessary has been stripped away by circumstance, when the social maintenance and the performance of normalcy and the management of other people's perceptions have all been temporarily suspended because the situation is too large for those things to fit inside it alongside everything else. What remains, when all of that falls away, is a person with nothing left to protect except the work itself. I became, in the 2 weeks following Marcus Webb's departure, the most productive version of myself I had been in 4 years. The first thing I rebuilt was the financial architecture of the firm. This was not optional. The fraud investigation required a complete forensic accounting of every transaction in the firm's history, which meant that Patricia's office and Robert Chen's investigation team needed access to records that had to be organized and annotated with a specificity that exceeded anything our previous accounting system had produced. I spent the first 3 days building a new accounting framework from scratch, working with our firm's accountant to implement a dual authorization system for all transactions above $5,000, a real-time alert protocol for any outgoing wire transfer regardless of amount, and a monthly reconciliation process that separated operational expenses from client-related disbursements in a way that made systematic rerouting structurally impossible. It was the financial control infrastructure that Marcus had spent 22 months exploiting the absence of. I built it in 3 days. I have thought about that often since. 3 days to construct the system that would have made everything he did impossible. 3 days that I had not taken in 36 months of partnership because I had been too busy building the thing that the system was supposed to protect. The lesson embedded in that timing is not a comfortable one. It is also not one I have allowed myself to avoid. The second thing I rebuilt was the client relationships. This required a different kind of work. Financial systems respond to technical inputs. Client relationships respond to the quality of attention and the credibility of the person providing it. Several of our active clients had noticed the postponement of their meetings and the change in their primary point of contact from a 2-person partnership to a single managing director, and they had questions that deserved honest, professional answers. I met with each of them personally over the course of the first 2 weeks. Not conference calls. Not written communications. In person, in their offices or at a location of their choosing, with the specific quality of direct attention that I have found, in 9 years of client work, to be the only reliable currency in professional relationships that are experiencing stress. I did not tell them the details of what had happened. I told them that the partnership had been dissolved due to a serious breach of fiduciary responsibility, that the matter was under federal investigation, and that the firm's client commitments would be honored in full under my direct management. I told them that their engagement records, billing history, and strategic documentation were all intact and that the quality of work they had been receiving would not change. Every single client renewed their engagement. The third thing I rebuilt, and the one that required the most from me, was my own understanding of what the firm was supposed to be. I had spent 3 years in a partnership that I had believed was taking the firm in a direction that reflected 2 people's vision equally. I had adjusted my own instincts and preferences on numerous occasions to accommodate a shared strategic direction that I now understood had been, in many ways, a negotiated compromise between what I actually wanted to build and what Marcus had presented as his vision while simultaneously stealing the resources required to build it. In the quiet of the evenings during those 2 weeks, after the staff had gone home and the office held only the sound of the ventilation system and the distant city, I sat at my desk with a yellow legal pad and wrote. Not client materials. Not case documentation. The actual vision. What I had wanted to build in year 1, before the partnership, before the compromises, before the accumulated weight of someone else's presence in the decisions that defined the firm's direction. It was clarifying in the way that loss is sometimes clarifying. When something is taken from you, what remains is what was always truly yours. The version of the firm I wrote on that legal pad during those quiet evenings was leaner, more focused, and more aligned with the specific work I had always been best at than anything the partnership had produced in 3 years. I was not healing in the sense of recovering from something and returning to the previous state. I was healing in the sense of becoming more precisely myself than I had been before the loss. The fourth thing I did during those 2 weeks was learn. I enrolled in a 40-hour online course in forensic accounting, not because I intended to practice forensic accounting professionally, but because the investigation had revealed a gap in my own knowledge that I was unwilling to leave unfilled. If I had understood the specific methodologies used in financial fraud detection at the level I now needed to understand them, I would have seen the pattern in our accounts 14 months earlier. Possibly earlier than that. I completed the course in 11 days, working through the modules in the early mornings before the office opened and in the late evenings after it closed. My instructor, a retired forensic accountant who answered questions through the course's online portal with the same precision he had likely applied to 30 years of fraud investigation, left a comment on my final assessment that said simply, "Exceptionally thorough analysis. You think like an investigator." I saved that comment. I am not someone who typically saves compliments. I saved that one because it described exactly the person I was becoming, and because becoming that person felt, in a way I had not anticipated, like the most useful possible response to what Marcus Webb had done. Robert Chin called me at the end of the second week. He told me that the investigation had made significant progress and that he needed to brief me on a development that would change the timeline considerably. I told him I was available immediately. What he told me confirmed something I had suspected but had not allowed myself to count on until I heard it from a federal investigator. Marcus Webb had not been as careful as he believed he had been. Robert Chin called back 2 days later with a name. The name was not Marcus Webb. It was the name of the institution that held the receiving account into which $800,000 had been wired on Monday night, and the name of the country in which that institution was domiciled, and a specific detail about the account's registration that changed the shape of the case in a way I had not anticipated. The account was registered to a limited liability company incorporated in the Cayman Islands 18 months earlier. The company's listed director was a name I did not recognize. Its registered business address was a law firm in Georgetown that Robert described, without elaborating, as a known facilitator of asset concealment structures for financial crimes originating in North America. 18 months. Marcus had incorporated the receiving entity 18 months ago, 4 months before he had established the domestic vendor accounts Patricia had identified in the firm's expense records. He had built the international exit infrastructure first, then constructed the domestic routing system to feed it, then spent 14 months moving smaller amounts through it while he waited for the right moment to take the rest. The planning timeline was not 22 months. It was 26. He had begun planning this 10 months into our partnership. I sat with that number for a moment after Robert told me. 10 months. At 10 months into the partnership, I had been finishing my first full year of working with someone I considered a trusted colleague and peer, managing what I had believed was a functional and productive professional relationship, and Marcus Webb had already been assembling the legal infrastructure for his exit. Robert told me the Cayman account registration was significant for 2 reasons. The first was that the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had an existing cooperative relationship with the relevant regulatory authority in the Cayman Islands and had already initiated a formal asset freeze request through that channel. International wire fraud involving the concealment of proceeds in an offshore account elevated the charges to a level that carried considerably more serious federal sentencing implications than domestic wire fraud alone. The second reason was more immediately useful. The account had received one prior transfer before the $800,000. A smaller amount, processed 4 months earlier, which Robert described as a likely test transaction to confirm the routing was functional. That transaction had been flagged by the receiving institution's compliance monitoring system at the time and logged, but not escalated, because it was below the automatic reporting threshold. The log existed. It was dated. It was now part of the federal evidentiary record. Marcus had tested the system 4 months ago, using firm funds, without my knowledge. The test transaction was documented. The documentation predated the main transfer by 4 months and established a pattern of deliberate, premeditated conduct. I thanked Robert, ended the call, and immediately forwarded the summary to Patricia. The same afternoon, something happened that I had not been expecting and that altered the dynamic of what I was navigating in a way that reminded me, at a moment when I needed reminding, that the relationships I had built over 9 years were real and durable in ways that Marcus's version of events had not accounted for. Elliot Marsh called. Elliot was the managing director of Hartfield Industrial, our largest client and the company whose restructuring engagement had been the subject of the presentation that had not happened on the morning Diana had found the account empty. He was 62, direct in a way that some people found abrupt and I had always found restful, and he had been working with me personally, not with the firm as an abstraction but with me specifically, for 4 years. He called my personal cell, not the office line. He said, "Diana, I have heard enough to understand that something serious has happened on the partnership side. I want you to know that Hartfield's relationship is with you and has always been with you. Whatever you need from us to support what you are building going forward, you have it." It was 11 words that changed the weight of the following weeks considerably. I thanked him with the specific directness that he preferred and asked him one thing: whether he would be willing to provide a written statement of Hartfield's continued engagement with the firm, on company letterhead, that I could use in conversations with other clients who might be less immediately certain of their position. He said he would have it to me by the end of the day. The letter arrived at 4:47. It was 2 paragraphs, precise and unambiguous, and it described Hartfield Industrial's relationship with the firm as ongoing, productive, and expected to continue for the foreseeable future under my direct management. I sent it to Patricia because it was relevant to the firm's valuation documentation. I also, privately, read it twice before putting it away, because there are moments in the middle of significant professional crises when evidence that what you have built is real and has value beyond the person who tried to take it from you is not a small thing to receive. The second ally arrived through a different channel and brought a different kind of resource. Her name was Josephine Tran, and she was a senior financial fraud investigator at the Regional Banking Authority with oversight jurisdiction over the type of fraud that had occurred in our account. She had been assigned to coordinate with Robert Chen's FBI investigation on the domestic side of the case and had called me to discuss the firm's account documentation. We spoke for 90 minutes on a Thursday afternoon, and by the end of the conversation she had become something more than a procedural contact. Josephine had investigated 47 wire fraud cases in her 12 years at the banking authority. She communicated with the specific efficiency of someone who has explained complex financial crime procedures to non-specialists enough times to have refined the explanation to its most precise and accessible form. She did not use jargon unnecessarily. She did not hedge information that did not require hedging. She told me what I needed to know in the order I needed to know it, which is, in my experience, the highest possible standard of professional communication. She also told me something that Robert had not yet told me, either because he had not known it at the time of our last conversation or because he had been waiting for the appropriate moment to disclose it. Marcus Webb had used his personal passport to board a flight to Nassau, Bahamas, 17 hours after the wire transfer, on Tuesday morning, while I had been walking around the lake and Robert Chen had been opening his investigation file. Nassau was not the Cayman Islands, but it was 200 miles from Georgetown and it was a jurisdiction with established entry routes for people whose next destination they preferred not to list on an international departure form. He had not gone to the Cayman Islands. He had gone somewhere close to the Cayman Islands while he determined whether it was safe to proceed. Josephine said this in the same even tone she used for everything else, and then she said, "What this means practically is that he has not yet accessed the offshore account. He is waiting to confirm the coast is clear before he moves." He does not yet know that the account has been frozen. I processed this for a moment. So he is in Nassau, I said, with no access to the $800,000, no knowledge that the receiving account is frozen, and no understanding of the scope of what the investigation currently contains. Correct, Josephine said. I thought about Marcus Webb in a hotel room in Nassau, watching the news, checking his phone, waiting for the moment when he believed it was safe to complete what he had spent 26 months constructing. He was waiting for a window that was not going to open. How long, I asked Josephine, before he understands that the window is not coming? She was quiet for a moment. When people in his situation realize the account is inaccessible, she said, they typically make one of two choices. They attempt to negotiate, or they attempt to run further. And which one does the evidence suggest he will choose? She paused again, with the specific quality of pause that precedes a precise answer. He has already sent 3 text messages to your business phone, she said, in the last 48 hours. We have the records. He is attempting to open a dialogue. He was going to negotiate. Which meant he was going to make contact. And when he made contact, he was going to do it believing that I was desperate and that he held the leverage. He did not know about Robert Chen. He did not know about Josephine Tran. He did not know about Elliot Marsh's letter, or Patricia's liability clause, or the Cayman account freeze, or the test transaction log from 4 months ago, or the forensic timeline Patricia had assembled covering 26 months of premeditated financial fraud. He thought he was negotiating from strength. I told Josephine I would call her in the morning. Then I called Patricia and told her to prepare for the possibility that Marcus Webb was about to make contact and that I needed to know, before he did, exactly what I was and was not legally permitted to say to him. Patricia's instructions were precise and took 11 minutes to deliver. She told me that under federal wire fraud investigation protocols, I was permitted to receive and retain any communication Marcus Webb initiated with me voluntarily, that I was not permitted to make any representation to him about the state of the investigation or the assets, that I was not permitted to make any promises or agreements regarding legal action without her explicit authorization, and that every communication he sent to me was now potentially evidentiary material that should be forwarded to Robert Chen's office within 1 hour of receipt. She also told me something that I found clarifying in its specificity. The moment Marcus Webb made voluntary contact with me, he would be providing evidence of consciousness of guilt. A person who has done nothing wrong does not disappear for 72 hours and then initiate negotiations with the person they have wronged. Every word he sent me would carry its own evidentiary weight regardless of its content. I thanked her. I ended the call. I opened the 3 text messages that Josephine had told me existed on my business phone. The first message had been sent Tuesday evening, 31 hours after the wire transfer. It said, "Diana, I know this looks bad. I need to explain. Please call me." The second had been sent Wednesday morning. It said, "I know you are angry. I understand. But there are things about the firm's situation you don't know. This is more complicated than it looks. Please call me before you do anything." The third had been sent Thursday morning, 4 hours before Josephine's call to me. It said, "Diana, I need to hear from you. I am willing to discuss a resolution. Please respond." I read all 3 messages twice. I want to tell you something about those messages that is important and that I did not fully appreciate until I had spent considerably more time than I wanted to thinking about it. They were not the messages of a person who believed he had done something unambiguously wrong. They were the messages of a person who had constructed a justification for what he had done and who was now attempting to create a negotiating context in which that justification could be presented as though it had merit. The phrase "there are things about the firm's situation you don't know" was the tell. It was the opening move of a negotiation strategy built on the premise that he possessed information I did not have, that this information would reframe the narrative in his favor, and that my desperation to recover the money would make me receptive to hearing it. He did not know that I was not desperate. He did not know what I knew. And he did not know that every message he sent was being forwarded to a federal investigator. I forwarded all 3 messages to Robert Chin within the hour, as Patricia had instructed, and then I returned to the work I had been doing before Josephine's call, which was the compilation of the supporting evidence documentation Robert had requested. Over the following 4 days, I built the most comprehensive financial evidence file I had assembled in 9 years of professional life. It was not complicated work in the creative sense. It was meticulous work in the forensic sense, the kind that requires sustained attention and a tolerance for the granular detail of financial records that most people find tedious and that I have always found, if I am honest, genuinely absorbing. The file had 5 sections. The first section contained the complete transaction history of the firm's operational accounts for the preceding 26 months, organized chronologically with each transaction annotated to indicate whether it was routine operational activity, part of the systematic rerouting pattern Patricia had identified, or one of the 2 direct transfers to the offshore entity. Every anomalous transaction was flagged with a reference to the corresponding vendor account or payee entity that received the funds. The second section contained the corporate registration documentation for each of the domestic vendor accounts Marcus had used to route the smaller amounts. I had pulled every available public record for each entity, including incorporation dates, registered agent information, business address filings, and any associated banking relationships that appeared in publicly accessible commercial databases. The pattern was identical across all 7 entities. Each had been incorporated within a 90-day window, each used the same registered agent service in a different state, and none had any documented business activity beyond the payments they received from our firm's accounts. The third section contained the Cayman Islands entity documentation that Robert had provided through his investigation, including the incorporation date, the listed director, the registered business address, and the record of the test transaction from 4 months earlier. This section also included a timeline visualization that Patricia's office had prepared showing the complete 26-month construction sequence: international entity first, domestic routing accounts second, systematic smaller transfers third, final wire transfer last. The fourth section was the one that had required the most time and the most careful construction. It was the intent documentation. Not the transactions themselves, which established the fact of the fraud, but the evidence that the fraud had been deliberately designed and systematically executed over an extended period with full knowledge of its fraudulent nature. This section contained 3 categories of material. The first was the timing evidence, the incorporation dates of the offshore entity and the domestic vendor accounts, mapped against key moments in the firm's business history, including the date of my original partnership offer to Marcus, the date we executed the partnership agreement, the date I had expanded his account authorization access, and the date of the first systematic transfer. The sequence was not ambiguous. The second category was the behavioral evidence, a documented record of Marcus's access to the firm's accounting system during the period of the systematic transfers, cross-referenced against the dates and amounts of the anomalous transactions, showing that every single irregular transfer had been initiated from his login credentials during periods when I was traveling for client meetings or otherwise not in the office. He had been careful about that. He had never initiated a fraudulent transaction on a day when I was physically present in the building. I had not noticed this pattern when it was occurring. Looking at it now, assembled in sequence, it was the most precise evidence of intent in the entire file. You do not systematically time your fraudulent transactions to coincide with your partner's absences by accident. The third category was the communication evidence. Over the preceding 26 months, Marcus and I had exchanged thousands of work communications through email and the firm's internal messaging system. Robert's team had subpoenaed the complete communication record from our email provider and our IT systems. Within that record, Patricia's team had identified 43 specific exchanges in which Marcus had provided me with financial information about the firm's accounts, vendor relationships, or expense categories that was demonstrably false at the time he provided it. Not vague or approximate. Specifically, documentably false, in ways that could be cross-referenced against the actual account records. He had lied to me about the money, in writing, 43 times, across 22 months. The fifth and final section of the file was the simplest and the most powerful. It was a single page. It contained the complete restitution calculation, the total amount transferred through the domestic routing system, plus the final wire transfer, plus accrued interest at the applicable federal judgment rate, plus Patricia's calculated estimate of consequential damages to the firm's business relationships and revenue during the period of the investigation. The total was $1,412,000. I sent the complete file to Robert Chen on a Friday afternoon. It was organized into 5 clearly labeled sections with a 1-page executive summary at the front and a master index at the back. Every document was digitally authenticated and timestamped. Every calculation was supported by source documentation. Robert called me 40 minutes after I sent it. He said, "Ms. Reeves, I have been doing this for 17 years. I want you to know that this is the most complete pre-prosecution evidence file I have received from a victim in the history of my career." I thanked him and asked him what happened next. He told me. And what he told me made the 4 days I had just spent on the file feel, in retrospect, like the most efficient 4 days I had spent in the previous 26 months. The grand jury was being convened the following Tuesday. Marcus Webb called on a Saturday morning. Not a text message this time. A call, from a number I did not recognize, which told me that he had acquired a new phone in whatever location he was currently occupying and had decided that the 3 unanswered text messages required escalation. I looked at the unfamiliar number for 2 full rings, confirmed with Patricia by text in the 30 seconds before I answered that I was legally clear to receive the call and that she would be available if I needed her immediately afterward, and then picked up. His voice was the same. I want to note that specifically because I had wondered, in the preceding days, whether the weight of what I knew would change how his voice landed when I heard it. It did not change it. He sounded exactly as he had always sounded, measured, confident, with the particular quality of unhurried authority he had cultivated over 20 years in finance. The voice of a man who was accustomed to being the most composed person in any conversation. "Diana," he said. "I am glad you answered." I said nothing. I had decided before answering that I would give him the space to speak first and that I would not fill silences he created. Silence is information. How a person fills silence tells you what they believe about the situation they are in. He filled it after approximately 3 seconds. "I know you are angry," he said. "I understand that. What I did was wrong and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I need you to hear me out before you make any decisions that are going to make this harder for both of us." I noted the phrase "harder for both of us." It was the first move of the negotiating strategy one had anticipated, the framing of his situation and my situation as symmetrical, as though we were 2 parties in a mutual difficulty rather than a perpetrator and a victim in a federal fraud investigation. I said, "I am listening." He said, "I did not take that money for the reasons you think. There are things about the firm's financial situation that I could not tell you directly because of how you would have reacted. We were in a worse position than you knew. I was trying to protect the firm and protect both of us by restructuring the assets in a way that gave us options if the Hartfield engagement fell through." I listened to this with the complete neutral attention I had been practicing for the preceding week. He continued. "The Cayman structure was not what it looks like. It was a legitimate asset protection vehicle that I set up to protect the firm's capital in a worst-case scenario. I should have told you. I know that. But I was trying to handle something you did not want to see was a problem." I processed what he had just said. He was presenting the offshore entity as a legitimate business structure that he had established for the firm's benefit without telling me, rather than as a personal asset concealment vehicle he had incorporated 26 months earlier in preparation for stealing everything. He was describing the domestic vendor accounts, presumably, as operational restructuring activities. He was framing the entire 26-month construction as a misguided but well-intentioned attempt to protect a business he claimed was in trouble. It was a coherent narrative. It was also entirely unsupported by the evidence, contradicted at every point by the documented timeline, and constructed by someone who did not know that I had spent the preceding 4 days compiling a 5-section evidence file that disproved every element of it with dated records. I said, "Marcus, when did you incorporate the Cayman entity?" There was a pause. "Approximately 18 months ago," he said. "Around the time the Hartfield engagement started showing some uncertainty. The Cayman entity had been incorporated 26 months ago. The Hartfield engagement had begun 20 months ago." He had given me a timeline that was both internally inconsistent and 4 months short of the documented incorporation date. Either he had miscalculated what I knew, or he had assumed I had not obtained the incorporation records. Both explanations said the same thing about how he had assessed my response to the situation. I said, "I see." He continued, the confidence in his voice settling into a more practiced register now that he believed the conversation was moving in a productive direction. "What I need you to understand," he said, "is that a federal investigation is going to hurt the firm more than it helps you. The publicity alone will cost you clients. The legal timeline will take years. I am willing to return the full amount of the transfer, plus interest, in exchange for a private resolution that keeps this out of federal court. You get your money back, the firm's reputation is protected, and we both move forward." He was offering me the $800,000 back. Not the $240,000 in systematic transfers. Not the $1,412,000 in total restitution calculated by Patricia. Not 26 months of premeditated fraud. The single wire transfer he believed I could see, offered back as the price of my silence, wrapped in the language of mutual protection and practical good sense. I sat with the offer for a moment. Not because I was considering it. Because I wanted to be certain, before I responded, that my response was the precise one the situation required. Then I said, "Marcus, I appreciate you calling. I am going to be direct with you. I am not in a position to discuss any resolution to this matter directly. You will need to contact Patricia Okafor's office. You have her number." He was quiet for a moment. "Diana," he said, and his voice had shifted, the practiced confidence thinning at its edges in a way I had never heard from him in 11 years. "I am trying to give you a way out of a process that is going to be very difficult for you. If you go the federal route, everything about the firm's finances becomes public record. Everything. Are you sure that is what you want?" It was the threat arriving at the end of the negotiation, the move you make when the offer has not landed and you need to remind the other person that you believe you hold leverage. He was suggesting that the investigation would expose something about the firm that I would prefer to keep private. There was nothing about the firm that I preferred to keep private. The firm's finances were clean. Every irregular transaction in the records bore his authorization code, not mine. I said, "You should speak with an attorney, Marcus. Goodbye." I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows a conversation you have been preparing for without being entirely certain it would unfold the way you had prepared for. It had unfolded precisely as I had prepared for. I forwarded the call log and my written account of the conversation to Robert Chin and Patricia within the hour, as I was required to do. Robert called back in 40 minutes. He told me that the call had been recorded by the investigation team through a legal intercept order that had been in place since Wednesday, that everything Marcus had said was now part of the federal evidentiary record, and that the offer of restitution in exchange for dropping a federal investigation was itself a potentially chargeable act. Marcus Webb had called me to negotiate his way out of a federal fraud case. He had done it from a location the FBI had been monitoring since Thursday. He had offered me money to stay quiet about a crime that was already in front of a grand jury. He had spent 26 months planning what he believed was a perfect exit. And then he had called me on a Saturday morning and handed the prosecution everything they needed for the obstruction charge. The grand jury convened on Tuesday morning as Robert had told me it would. I was not present. Grand jury proceedings are closed, conducted without the subject's knowledge or participation, and the witnesses who appear before them are bound by strict confidentiality requirements that prevent them from disclosing what was said or asked. What I knew was that the proceeding was happening, that Robert's team had submitted the complete evidence file I had compiled along with the recorded Saturday phone call and the 26-month timeline Patricia had constructed, and that the grand jury would determine, based on that material, whether the evidence was sufficient to support an indictment. I spent Tuesday at the office. I reviewed contracts, met with 2 clients, approved the final version of a strategic planning document for Hartfield's next quarter, and ate lunch at my desk because the alternative was sitting in a restaurant making conversation with people who did not know what was happening, and I did not have the capacity that day for the performance of ordinary social normalcy. Renee brought me coffee at 2 o'clock without being asked. She set it on my desk and left without comment. It was, in its complete absence of theatrics, one of the more genuinely supportive things anyone did for me during that entire period. Patricia called at 4:15. She told me that her contact at the federal courthouse had confirmed that the grand jury proceedings were moving efficiently and that the scope of the indictment being considered was broader than the original wire fraud charge. The Saturday phone call had done exactly what Robert had suggested it might do. The offer of money in exchange for dropping a federal investigation, made to a victim by a subject who was under active investigation and aware of that investigation, met the federal definition of obstruction of justice with a specificity that the prosecution found, Patricia said, using a word she did not often deploy, delightful. Marcus Webb had added an obstruction charge to his own indictment by calling me. The asset picture had also developed during the preceding days in ways that significantly changed the restitution calculation. The Cayman account freeze had held, meaning the $800,000 from the wire transfer was legally inaccessible and would remain so pending the outcome of the federal case. The cooperative investigation between Robert's FBI unit and the Cayman Regulatory Authority had additionally identified 2 other accounts in the same institution that were registered to entities with the same registered agent as the original offshore company. Both accounts contained funds. The combined balance across all 3 accounts was $1,100,000. Marcus had not only taken what he stole from me. He had apparently been accumulating elsewhere as well. The investigation was examining the sources of the additional funds and whether they represented proceeds of other fraudulent activity predating our partnership. He had been building this for longer than 26 months. The 26 months I had documented was the portion that involved me. What preceded it was a different investigation that had now been opened by a different team. I sat with this information for a while after ending the call with Patricia. There is a specific quality to the moment when you understand that something you believed was about you was never primarily about you. The 26 months Marcus had spent constructing the fraud against our firm, which I had experienced as a targeted, personal betrayal by someone I had trusted specifically, was apparently one chapter in a longer pattern of behavior that had nothing to do with me as an individual and everything to do with who he was as a person operating repeatedly in environments that gave him access to other people's financial resources. This did not make the betrayal smaller, but it recontextualized it in a way that was, unexpectedly, less painful than the alternative. The version in which Marcus had specifically targeted me, had chosen me as a victim because of something particular about me or my trust or my professional relationship with him, was a story in which I was the protagonist of my own victimization. The version in which I was one of several people he had done this to was a story in which I was simply someone who had been in proximity to a person who did this regardless of who was in proximity to him. The second story was considerably less personal. And being less personal, it was also considerably less consuming. I called Robert the following morning and asked him directly, was I targeted specifically or was this a pattern? He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding how much to disclose. Then he said, the investigation is ongoing and I cannot speak to specifics outside the scope of your case. What I can tell you is that the evidence we have encountered in the course of this investigation suggests a sophistication and a consistency that is not consistent with a first offense. That was all I needed to know. The legal fortification of my position concluded over the following week in 3 specific actions that Patricia and I had planned in sequence. The first was the formal civil complaint filed in federal district court against Marcus Webb personally, citing breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of business assets, fraudulent misrepresentation, and unjust enrichment. The civil complaint ran parallel to the federal criminal investigation and served two purposes. It established a legal claim against his personal assets that would operate independently of the criminal restitution process, and it created a public record of the civil action that would be accessible regardless of how the criminal proceeding concluded. The second action was the filing of a formal claim with the firm's business crime insurance carrier, which had a policy provision covering losses from employee fraud and breach of fiduciary duty by a partner or officer. The claim process was lengthy and the outcome not guaranteed, but Patricia had reviewed the policy language with the specific attention she applied to everything and had determined that the documented evidence made the claim both eligible and strong. The third action was the one that required the most from me personally, not legally but in terms of what it meant to do it. I formally dissolved the partnership agreement and filed the dissolution documentation with the state, terminating Marcus Webb's legal standing as a partner in the firm I had built. The filing was routine in its administrative form. It took Patricia's office 4 minutes to complete. It took me considerably longer to look at the confirmation document when it arrived, because the confirmation document said, in the flat bureaucratic language of official records, that something I had built with the specific hope that shared ownership would make it stronger was now entirely and only mine again. It was mine again in the specific way that things become yours after you have fought to keep them. Which is a different kind of ownership than the kind you have when you simply build something and hold it uncontested. It is harder and heavier and it carries more information about what it cost. The Thursday before the Friday on which I would receive the call I had been waiting for, I stayed at the office until 9 o'clock in the evening. Not working on the case. Working on a proposal for a new client engagement that Renee had flagged 3 weeks earlier and that I had not had the bandwidth to address. It was a mid-sized logistics company looking for a strategic financial restructuring consultant. The scope was exactly the kind of work I did best. The budget was significant. I finished the proposal at 8:50, read through it twice, made 4 edits, and saved the final version. Then I turned off the office lights, took the elevator to the parking garage, and drove home through the ordinary Thursday night streets of Charlotte, past the restaurants and the traffic and the lit windows of the buildings where other people were conducting the ordinary business of their lives, entirely unaware that on the 4th floor of a building on the eastern edge of the financial district, a woman had just finished writing a proposal for the first new engagement of the next chapter of the firm she had built and was now rebuilding and intended never to stop building regardless of what anyone did to interrupt her. My phone rang at 8:47 the next morning. It was Robert Chen. He said, "Ms. Reeves, the grand jury returned an indictment this morning on all counts. I need to tell you what happens next." What Robert told me in those next 12 minutes was the operational sequence of events that would occur over the following 72 hours, delivered in the careful, measured language of a federal investigator who has learned through experience that the people receiving this information need precision more than they need reassurance. The indictment covered 7 counts. Wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, international transportation of stolen funds, and a 7th count that Robert described simply as relating to the pattern of conduct identified in the parallel investigation, the details of which he said he was not yet in a position to share with me but which I would learn about through the public record when the indictment was unsealed. The arrest was coordinated between the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, Interpol's Financial Crimes Division, and the Royal Bahamas Police Force. Marcus Webb had not left Nassau in the 17 days since his arrival. He had been staying at a hotel in Cable Beach under his own name, which Robert noted with the specific dry understatement of someone who has spent a career watching people who believe they are clever make decisions that are not clever. He had stayed in Nassau under his own name, checked into a hotel that accepted the same passport the FBI had his international travel record on, and waited for a frozen account to become accessible. He had not moved, had not changed his identity, had not taken any of the operational security steps that might have extended the timeline of his situation, because he had not believed the situation was as advanced as it was. He had underestimated the speed of the investigation. He had underestimated the quality of the evidence. He had underestimated Patricia Okafor, Robert Chin, Josephine Tran, and the Cayman Regulatory Authority. And he had underestimated me. The arrest happened at 6:41 in the morning Nassau time, which was 7:41 in the morning Charlotte time, on a Friday. I know the exact time because Robert called me at 7:43, 2 minutes after it was complete, and told me. I was at my kitchen table with coffee when the call came, which was the same place I had been sitting 17 days earlier when I had looked at a bank balance of 0 and made the first call that set everything that followed into motion. He said, "Ms. Reeves. Marcus Webb was taken into custody in Nassau at 6:41 this morning. He is being processed for extradition to the United States. The indictment has been unsealed. The charges are now public record." I set my coffee cup down on the kitchen table. I want to describe what I felt in that moment accurately, because I think accuracy matters more than drama when you are talking about something real. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the specific satisfaction of someone who has watched an enemy fall. What I felt was something quieter and more structural than either of those things. It was the feeling of a system working correctly. Of a set of mechanisms, legal and investigative and institutional, doing precisely what they were designed to do when the evidence presented to them was organized and complete and true. Marcus Webb was in custody because what he had done was documentable and documented, and because the people whose professional responsibility was to act on that documentation had done their jobs with the same thoroughness I had tried to bring to mine. The system had worked. That was not a small thing to feel. I called Patricia. I called Renee. I called Elliot Marsh, who answered on the second ring and said, in the direct manner I had always found restful, "Good. Now let's talk about Q3. The extradition took 11 weeks. The legal proceedings that followed took 14 months. Marcus Webb entered a guilty plea on 5 of the 7 counts 3 weeks before the scheduled trial date, which Patricia told me was a decision driven by the comprehensiveness of the evidence and the specific weight of the obstruction charge, which carried sentencing implications that his attorneys had apparently found sufficiently alarming to recommend against a trial. He was sentenced to 9 years and 4 months in federal prison. The sentencing judge cited, in her remarks, the extended premeditation period, the international asset concealment structure, the obstruction attempt, and the evidence of prior similar conduct identified in the parallel investigation, the details of which became public at sentencing and which I will not detail here because they belong to other people's stories, not mine. The restitution order covered $1,412,000, the full amount Patricia had calculated. The Cayman accounts, once unfrozen and repatriated through the federal asset recovery process, covered $890,000 of it. The remainder was secured through a civil judgment against his personal assets, the enforcement of which Patricia managed with the same precision she applied to everything. The logistics company proposal I had finished on the Thursday evening before Robert's Friday morning call became a signed engagement 4 weeks after the arrest. Hartfield Industrial expanded their retainer at the end of the year. The firm added 2 new staff members in the spring. By the 18-month mark following Marcus Webb's departure, the firm's revenue had exceeded any year in which he had been a partner. I think about that number sometimes. Not with the specific satisfaction of someone keeping score, but with the more useful recognition that the presence of the wrong person in a structure you are building does not only take what it visibly takes. It takes the version of the thing you would have built without them. The firm I rebuilt after Marcus left was closer to what I had originally envisioned than anything we had built together. That is not a coincidence. It is what happens when you stop accommodating someone else's version of your own work. The new client agreement I signed in the month after his arrest had a dual authorization clause for all transactions above $2,000, a monthly forensic reconciliation protocol, and a personal liability provision that covered the full value of any assets under management. My attorney drafted it. I had written the first version myself, longhand, on a yellow legal pad, the night after Robertson told me the grand jury had returned its indictment. I have never needed to enforce it. Lessons from this story. The first lesson is about the specific blindness that trust creates. Diana's greatest professional vulnerability was not her choice of partner. It was the operational gap between the trust she extended and the verification systems she did not build. Trust is a reasonable and necessary component of any productive professional relationship. It is not a substitute for financial controls. The two things are not in conflict with each other. A dual authorization system does not mean you distrust your partner. It means you have built a structure that protects both of you from the worst possibilities regardless of who either of you turns out to be. Building that structure is not cynicism. It is the highest form of professional responsibility you can demonstrate to someone you are asking to share your work. The second lesson is about the intelligence embedded in a paper trail. Marcus Webb spent 26 months constructing what he believed was an undetectable architecture of fraud. He incorporated entities in offshore jurisdictions, used layered domestic routing accounts, and timed every transaction to coincide with his partner's absences. And the entire structure was dismantled in 4 days by a woman with a spreadsheet, a forensic accounting course, and 11 years of experience reading financial records. The digital trail of financial transactions is permanent, legally accessible, and forensically coherent in ways that the people who exploit financial systems consistently underestimate. Every wire transfer is a federal document. Every authorization code is a signature. Every incorporation date is a timestamp. The sophistication of the crime does not reduce the completeness of the record. It only increases the number of records that exist. The third lesson is the one that took me the longest to understand fully, and it is this: the most powerful response to betrayal is not confrontation, and it is not silence in the passive sense. It is the construction of something so complete, so organized, and so thoroughly documented that the person who tried to take what you built is forced to reckon with the full weight of what they did in a forum they cannot control and on a timeline they cannot alter. Diana did not scream. She did not negotiate. She did not post anything online or call mutual colleagues or attempt to publicly shame a man who was still in Nassau believing he had successfully escaped. She built a 5-section evidence file, hired the right people, learned what she needed to learn, and submitted documentation so comprehensive that a federal investigator with 17 years of experience called it the best he had ever received. That is not a story about revenge. That is a story about what happens when someone who is very good at building things decides to apply that skill to the problem of justice. The outcome was not in doubt from that point forward. It never is, when the documentation is complete and the person building it refuses to stop.